Miami Biltmore Hotel is a luxury hotel in Coral Gables, Florida, United States. It was designed by Schultz and Weaver and was built in 1926 by John McKenty Bowman and George Merrick as part of the Biltmore Hotel chain. The tower is inspired by the Giralda, the medieval tower of the Cathedral of Seville. When completed, it became the tallest building in Florida at 315 feet, holding the record until 1928 when the Dade County Courthouse was built. At one time, the pool was the largest pool in the world, and among the many attractions was swimming instructor Johnny Weissmuller. It served as a hospital during World War II and as a VA hospital and campus of the University of Miami Medical School until 1968. Abandoned for many years, it became a hotel again in 1987. It was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1996. The Vizcaya Museum and Gardens, previously known as Villa Vizcaya, is the former villa and estate of businessman James Deering, of the Deering-McCormick International Harvester Fortune, on Biscayne Bay in the present-day Coconut Grove neighborhood of Miami, Florida. The early 20th century Vizcaya estate also includes extensive Italian Renaissance gardens, native woodland landscape, and a historic village outbuildings compound. The landscape and architecture were influenced by Veneto and Tuscan Italian Renaissance models and designed in the Mediterranean Revival architecture style, with Baroque elements. F. Burrell Hoffman was the architect, Paul Chalfin was the design director, and Diego Suarez was the landscape architect. Miami-Dade County now owns the Vizcaya property as the Vizcaya Museum and Gardens, which is open to the public. The location is served by the Vizcaya station of the Miami Metrorail. Miami Beach is a coastal resort city in Miami-Dade County, Florida. It was incorporated on March 26, 1915. The municipality is located on natural and man-made barrier islands between the Atlantic Ocean and Biscayne Bay, the latter of which separates the beach from the mainland city of Miami. The neighborhood of South Beach, comprising the southernmost 2.5 square miles of Miami Beach, along with downtown Miami and the Port Miami, collectively form the commercial center of South Florida. Miami Beach's population is 82,890 according to the 2020 census. Miami Beach is the 26th largest city in Florida based on official 2019 estimates from the U.S. Census Bureau. It has been one of America's preeminent beach resorts since the early 20th century. In 1979, Miami Beach's Art Deco Historic District was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The Art Deco District is the largest collection of Art Deco architecture in the world and comprises hundreds of hotels, apartments and other structures erected between 1923 and 1943. Mediterranean, Streamline Moderne and Art Deco are all represented in the district. The historic district is bounded by the Atlantic Ocean on the east, Lenox Court on the west, 6th Street on the south and Dade Boulevard along the Collins Canal to the north. The movement to preserve the Art Deco district's architectural heritage was led by former interior designer Barbara Bear Capitman, who now has a street in the district named in her honor. Miami Beach is the city in the United States most immediately threatened by climate-driven sea level rise and flooding. The city of Miami Beach accounts for more than half of tourism to Miami-Dade County. Miami Beach hosts 13.3 million visitors each year. In fiscal year 2016-2017, Miami Beach had over 26,600 hotel rooms. South Beach, the area from Biscayne Street 1 block south of 1st Street to about 23rd Street, is one of the more popular areas of Miami Beach. Fort Lauderdale is a coastal city located in the U.S. state of Florida, 30 miles north of Miami along the Atlantic Ocean. It is the county seat of and largest city in Broward County with a population of 182,760 as of the 2020 census, making it the 10th largest city in Florida. Along with Miami and Pompano Beach, Fort Lauderdale is one of the three principal cities that comprise the Miami metropolitan area, which has a population of 6,166,488. Built in 1838 and first incorporated in 1911, Fort Lauderdale is named after a series of forts built by the United States during the Second Seminole War. The forts took their name from Major William Lauderdale, younger brother of Lieutenant Colonel James Lauderdale. Development of the city did not begin until 50 years after the forts were abandoned at the end of the conflict. Known as the Venice of America, Fort Lauderdale has 165 miles of inland waterways across the city. In addition to tourism, Fort Lauderdale has a diversified economy including marine, manufacturing, finance, insurance, real estate, high technology, avionics/aerospace, film, and television production. The city is a popular tourist destination with an average year-round temperature of 75.5 F and 3,000 hours of sunshine per year. Greater Fort Lauderdale, encompassing all of Broward County, hosted more than 13 million overnight visitors in 2018. Each year nearly 4 million cruise passengers pass through its Port Everglades, making it the third largest cruise port in the world. With over 50,000 registered yachts and 100 marinas, Fort Lauderdale is also known as the yachting capital of the world. According to the Köppen climate classification, Fort Lauderdale has a tropical rainforest climate. Like many parts of Florida, the city's population has a strong seasonal variation, as snowbirds from the northern United States, Canada, and Europe spend the winter and spring in Florida. Boca Raton is a city in Palm Beach County, Florida, United States. The population was 97,422 in the 2020 census, and it ranked as the 23rd largest city in Florida in 2022. However, many people with a Boca Raton postal address live outside of municipal boundaries, such as in West Boca Raton. As a business center, the city also experiences significant daytime population increases. Boca Raton is 45 miles north of Miami and is a principal city of the Miami metropolitan area, which had a population of 6,138,333 at the 2020 United States Census. It was first incorporated on August 2, 1924 as Boca Raton, and then incorporated as Boca Raton on May 26, 1925. While the area had been inhabited by the Glades culture, as well as Spanish and later British colonial empires prior to its annexation by the United States, the city's present form was developed predominantly by Addison Misner starting in the 1920s. Misner contributed to many buildings in the area having Mediterranean Revival or Spanish Colonial Revival architecture. Boca Raton also became a key city in the development of the early computer industry. The city is the birthplace of IBM's first personal computer and various other technologies created by the company. Picture City was a planned community in Hobe Sound, Florida, intended to be centered around the cinema industry. During the land boom of the 1920s, the Olympia Improvement Company announced elaborate plans for Hobe Sound. Its goal was to create a town, in Greek style, where motion pictures could be produced. Street names bore the Greek theme with names such as Zeus, Saturn, Mercury, Mars, Olympus, Pluto, and Athena. For a brief time, Hobe Sound was renamed Picture City, and plans were presented for a movie picture production center, very similar to Hollywood, California. The boom collapsed after the 1928 Okeechobee hurricane, and the original name was restored. Street names remained, however, as did the concrete streetlight posts along Dixie Highway. In 1924, the building which soon would become the new schoolhouse in Hobe Sound was constructed. The Martin County Board of Public Instruction secured the use of the new school building from the Picture City Corporation in 1925, and in October of that year, the Olympia School opened. The school was designated the Picture City School of Martin County. It remained in use as a school until 1962. There is currently local interest in restoring the school, now known as the Apollo School. Other mementos of the past are gone, including the ice plant, which was south of Bridge Road, and the old train station, which now, refurbished and relocated west of Hobe Sound, Florida, serves as an office building for Becca Groves, and the Texaco station east of the Winn-Dixie Plaza. St. Lucie Nuclear Power Plant is a twin nuclear power station located on Hutchinson Island, near Port St. Lucie in St. Lucie County, Florida. Both units are combustion engineering pressurized water reactors. Florida Power and Light commissioned the station in 1976 and continues to operate the station. Minor shares of Unit 2 are owned by the Florida Municipal Power Agency and the Orlando Utilities Commission. The plant contains 2 nuclear reactors in separate containment buildings. However, the plant does not have the classic hyperboloid cooling towers found at many inland reactor sites. Instead, it uses nearby ocean water for coolant of the secondary system. In 2003, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission extended the operating licenses of the St. Lucie units by 20 years, to March 1, 2036 for Unit 1 and April 6, 2043 for Unit 2. The National Navy UDT SEAL Museum, also known as the Navy SEAL Museum, is located in St. Lucie County, just outside Fort Pierce, Florida. It houses exhibits to inform and educate on the role of Navy underwater demolition teams and sea, air, land teams. The museum also preserves the history of the SEALs. The idea of the museum originated in the home of Albert Stanky, where he and other former UDT frogmen gathered personal artifacts and experiences from their service in World War II. They worked to procure the defunct Fort Pierce Treasure Museum building and site. This evolved into a dedicated facility, which opened in 1985, and was recognized as a national museum by an act of Congress signed into law February 7, 2008. Patrick Space Force Base is a United States Space Force installation located between Satellite Beach and Coco Beach, in Brevard County, Florida, in the United States. It is home to Space Launch Delta 45, known as the 45th Space Wing when it was part of the Air Force. In addition to its host wing responsibilities at Patrick SFB, the 45SW controls and operates Cape Canaveral Space Force Station and the Eastern Range. It was originally opened and operated from 1940 to 1947 as Naval Air Station Banana River, a U.S. Navy airfield. It was then deactivated as a naval installation in 1947 and placed in caretaker status until it was transferred to the Air Force in late 1948. Coco Beach is a city in Brevard County, Florida. The population was 11,539 at the 2018 United States Census. It is part of the Palm Bay-Melbourne-Titusville, Florida Metropolitan Statistical Area. According to the United States Census Bureau, the city has a total area of 15.0 square miles. 4.9 square miles of it is land and 10.1 square miles of it is water. Bordering the city on the north is Cape Canaveral, on the south is Crescent Beach, on the east is the Atlantic Ocean, on the west is the Banana River. Propelled by a powerful hurricane, the ocean pushed its way through the barrier islands centuries ago and formed the Thousand Islands in the Banana River. There are a number of boating channels dredged in the area: the 0 to 99 channel, the 100 channel, the 200 channel for houseboats, the 300 channel, the 400 channel near housing for private boats, the 500 channel and the 600 channel. Dredged material is placed on one of the Thousand Islands, but is now controlled. Many of the homes in Coco Beach are built on dredged mud and sand from the Banana River. The first non-native settlement in the area was by a family of freed slaves following the American Civil War. In 1888, a group of men from Coco bought the entire tract of land, which went undeveloped until it was bought out in 1923 by a member of the group, Gus Edwards, Coco's city attorney. At that time, Edwards' total holdings included approximately 600 acres. He stopped practicing law to devote all his efforts to developing the area. Launch Complex 6 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, Florida is a launch site used by Redstone and Jupiter series rockets and missiles. It is on the south end of Cape Canaveral, close to Launch Complex 5, with which it shared a blockhouse. With LC-5, it was the location of the first tests of the mobile launch concept designed by Kurt H. Debus. This concept was revised and improved and eventually used at LC-39 for the Saturn V and Space Shuttle. LC-6 was deactivated in 1961. The blockhouse and a 61.96 meters square concrete pad are the only parts of the complex that remain intact, although the mobile service tower was under restoration as of 2011. The complex is part of the Cape Canaveral, then and now tour, available from the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex. The Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex is the visitor center at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. It features exhibits and displays, historic spacecraft and memorabilia, shows, 2 IMAX theaters, and a range of bus tours of the spaceport. The Space Shuttle Atlantis exhibit contains the Atlantis orbiter and the shuttle launch experience, a simulated ride into space. The center also provides astronaut training experiences, including a multi-axial chair and Mars base simulator. The visitor complex also has daily presentations from a veteran NASA astronaut. A bus tour, included with admission, encompasses the separate Apollo/Saturn V Center. There were 1.7 million visitors to the visitor complex in 2016. The Vehicle Assembly Building, or VOB, is the large building at NASA's Kennedy Space Center, designed to assemble the large pre-manufactured space vehicle components, such as the massive Saturn V and the Space Shuttle, and stack them vertically onto the mobile launcher platform and crawler transporter. The future Space Launch System will also be assembled there. At 129,428,000 cubic feet, it is one of the largest buildings in the world by volume. The building is at Launch Complex 39 at Vizcaya, halfway between Jacksonville and Miami, and due east of Orlando on Merritt Island on the Atlantic coast of Florida. The VOB is the largest single-story building in the world, was the tallest building in Florida until 1974, and is still the tallest building in the United States outside an urban area. Launch Complex 39 is a rocket launch site at the John F. Kennedy Space Center on Merritt Island in Florida, United States. The site and its collection of facilities were originally built as the Apollo program's moonport and later modified for the Space Shuttle program. Launch Complex 39 consists of 3 launch subcomplexes or pads: 39A, 39B, and 39C, a vehicle assembly building, a crawlerway used by crawler transporters to carry mobile launcher platforms between the VOB and the pads, orbiter processing facility buildings, a launch control center which contains the firing rooms, a news facility famous for the iconic countdown clock seen in television coverage and photos, and various logistical and operational support buildings. SpaceX leases Launch Complex 39A from NASA and has modified the pad to support Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy launches. NASA began modifying Launch Complex 39B in 2007 to accommodate the now defunct Constellation program, and is currently preparing it for the Artemis program, whose first launch is scheduled for no earlier than 2021. A pad to be designated 39C, which would have been a copy of pads 39A and 39B, was originally planned for Apollo but never built. A smaller pad, also designated 39C, was constructed from January to June 2015 to accommodate small lift launch vehicles. NASA launches from pads 39A and 39B have been supervised from the NASA Launch Control Center, located 3 miles from the launch pads. LC-39 is one of several launch sites that share the radar and tracking services at the Eastern Test Range. The Shuttle Landing Facility is an airport located on Merritt Island in Brevard County, Florida, United States. It is a part of the Kennedy Space Center and was used by Space Shuttle for landing until July 2011. It was also used for takeoffs and landings for NASA training jets such as the shuttle carrier aircraft and for civilian aircraft. Starting in 2015, Space Florida manages and operates the facility under a 30-year lease from NASA. Private companies have been utilizing the SLF for its unique properties since 2011 and will continue to do so via Space Launch Florida.